in order to get things started, I feel that some visual aid or something is required. Otherwise, you'll just spend the whole time sitting here looking at me, which could be really sad. But my visual aid actually isn't very good. You all see this down the back there? See this lovely little pocket-sized thing? I'll tell you what it is. It's actually a public transport map of Greater Vancouver, given to me by a former student of mine who now glories in the title of UPass Commissioner at the University of British Columbia. This map is given for free to every university student who starts at the start of the academic year throughout the Greater Vancouver. It's produced by the Regional Public Transport Authority, TransLink, and sponsored by some bank that thinks that this is a way of snaring students as customers for life. Along with the public transport map, they also get UPass, which is a free public transport pass that covers them for the entire academic year. That's funded partly by the Transit Agency, partly by the universities, and partly by a supplement to the student union fees. That's the kind of thing that's going on in cities where public transport is really making a difference and really fighting back against the car. The University of British Columbia is a bit like Monash, for those of you that know our dear friend Monash University. It's in the suburbs and it has a lot of car parking and it's not on the rail system. 10 years ago, around 3/4 of staff and students travelled to the campus by car. It's now half and falling as public transport is gradually becoming the dominant mode for access to and from campus. So that's an illustration of what it's possible to achieve with serious planning for public transport. Now, of course, you can't get one of these in Melbourne. I don't mean a small pocket-sized one handed out to students. I mean a public transport map. There hasn't been one available since 2006. You used to be able to go down and buy one at the Met shop for $2, but they've stopped printing them because no one can remember whose job it was to produce the public transport map, and as a result, they're not happening. Now, it's a shame that we don't have one, because what I wanted to do next is compare that scene to about as different places you could possibly imagine, and it never hurts to have a map. I thought, since we're talking suburbs, which is always a dangerous thing to do in an inner-city venue, but, I thought I should try this. Has anyone popped up from the Toyota factory in North Altona for their lunch break? Can we have a show of hands? Astonishing. But there you go. Toyota Altona is the largest single employer in the suburbs of Melbourne, outside the central business district. As some of you would know, it opened in 1995 in Grieve Parade, and it employs 5,000 staff. There is no bus service along Grieve Parade, and there are no trains anywhere near there, so all of the 5,000 have to drive. If you live in Altona and work in North Altona, at the Toyota factory you have to drive, because it's 4 or 5 kilometres and only the very, very hardy would walk. And I tell you, trying to cycle around that part of Melbourne would suggest that you perhaps aim to reduce your life expectancy. So, 15 years after this plant opened, it's impossible to get to it by public transport. In Melbourne, of course, we regard that kind of thing as perfectly normal. I've already mentioned Monash University once. Monash University, arguably, although there's some definitional dispute about this, is not the largest suburban employer in Melbourne, but it's the largest single generator of travel in the suburbs of Melbourne. Now, you can get to Monash University by bus, but it requires not just some ingenuity, but it requires you to be a glutton for punishment. What you do is you take the train from across the road there. You can't, of course, walk straight into the station now because someone blocked it off a few years ago and put a Coles store in, but it's all right. Eventually you can find your way back into the station. It was decided, of course, that renting the space for a Coles supermarket was more important than the convenience of public transport users, because again, no one involved in the transaction thought that it was their job to look after public transport users. They all had other objectives. You can take the train out to Huntingdale Station. I don't know, any of you ever been to Huntingdale Station? It's one of the truly magnificent features of Melbourne. It was built in the 1970s. It kind of looks like a public lavatory. It does in fact have public lavatories at it, but they're locked, of course, because the station's unstaffed. You walk out of the station down this really claustrophobic subway that, when you get to the bottom, smells as if people have been responding in the subway to the fact that there's no public lavatory open at the station, if you take my meaning. You emerge from the subway in a car park, which you then have to walk across in the rain. Somewhere on the other side of the car park is Huntingdale Road, which you then have to cross, and then there are 2 bus stops because there are 2 separate routes that go to Monash. One of them leaves in Huntingdale Road off to your left, the other leaves in the little service lane next to the big road overpass off to your right. Which one do you go to? Well, you just have to guess. Of course, if you guess wrong and go to one stop and the bus comes to the other, you've missed the bus, blow me down. Now, of course, the buses don't connect with the trains, so you get a lot of time to explore the environs there, sitting there next to the blank concrete wall of the overpass. The shelter holds 5 people if they really squeeze in, but there can be as many as 300 students waiting there for a bus, because Monash does have 25,000 students and another 3,000 or 4,000 staff, and they don't put on enough buses. It's a truly extraordinary experience, and it's particularly intellectually significant because on St Patrick's Day next year, Monash will have been open for half a century. So if nothing is done to improve this between now and the 17th of March next year, and based on the progress in the last 49 years and 9 months, one could conclude that that will be the case, then we will have had this kind of appalling environment there for half a century. Generation after generation of Monash students have been turned off public transport and turned into car commuters by this kind of thing. Interestingly enough, you don't have to go to Vancouver to see how that could be done better. You could simply go across to Perth. In Perth, they're all very proud of their new rail system there that was electrified in the 1980s, extended in the 1990s, and they've just finished extending it again, doubling it in size. It now carries 8 times as many passengers as it carried 20 years ago. The largest of the new projects is the Mandurah Line, which you can catch by getting an underground train. The line runs underground under the city centre, then runs down the median strip of the Kwinana Freeway. There was nowhere else to put it. It gives you the enjoyable experience of getting to overtake the cars in the train. Even in the off-peak, when the cars are doing 110, you still overtake them in the train, and that's the stopping all stations train. So you get to Murdoch Station in almost no time at all. Unfortunately, rather like the Monash situation, Murdoch University is about 1 kilometre away, so you have to get off and catch a bus. What do? Well, you get off the train, step onto the escalators, and when you get to the top of the escalators, the buses are all waiting there for you undercover. Astonishing. How could that be the case? There are, in fact, 5 different bus routes that go from the station to Murdoch University, and they all leave from the same stop. Isn't that extraordinary? Because as it turns out, you just want to get to Murdoch University, and you don't care whether it's a 212 bus or a 472 bus. So it's so easy that they can do it in Western Australia. A truly extraordinary thought. This is not one of these fancy European or Northern Hemisphere cities. This is not Singapore or Tokyo. This is sad little Perth, which we generally tend to think we're superior towards. But on this issue, we most certainly are not. And we haven't even got onto the subject of how it is that they managed to get a smart card ticketing system that cost $35 million, that works better than ours, that cost $1,350 million. If you read The Age today, you will see that their public transport is mentioned twice in effectively their editorial situation. They talk about problems with public transport in the actual editorial, and then there's an op-ed column by their political editor in which they point out that the state government has an election slogan that I've already forgotten. It's that memorable. I think it's their version of moving forward. And basically it says, concentrate on the future, don't think about our record. Now, why are they doing that? Well, I think one of the reasons is because public transport is the number one issue. It might be equal first. In fact, if you listen to people who, pollsters, pundits, it's either equal first with water, or with law and order, or with climate change, or with all of them perhaps, who knows. But funnily enough, and this is the first Victorian election I can recall this being in, it is equal first. And I would argue that Pache, George Orwell, it may be somewhat more equal than the other things that are all equal first, because they're not always cited, and it is. So no wonder the government doesn't want to talk about their record. They want to talk about the future. But the problem is, the future ought to involve fixing these problems, and they at the moment seem to have nothing to offer to fix these problems. It's all part of the plan, of course, we know, because you can't turn a commercial TV station on without hearing that they've got a plan and that's going to cost a lot of money. It doesn't involve providing a bus service to the Toyota factory at North Altona, and it doesn't involve doing anything about the mess at Monash University and Huntingdale Station. Apparently it's going to cost $38 billion, but it's not actually going to fix any of those problems. The opposition, on the other hand, are very happy to talk about the past. In fact, they're more happy to talk about the government's record than they are to talk about what they would do if they actually won office. To date, they've told us that they will commission a study into whether there should be a train line to Monash University. Sounds good. and another study into whether there should be a train line to Doncaster. But I guess the question is, studies are all very good, but how would these rail lines happen? Who would build them, and where would the money come from? Now, in Perth, you can talk about where the next rail line will be because we know that they have a public transport authority that can build rail lines on time, within budget, and they work. Here in Victoria, well, 11 years after the government was elected promising to extend the Epping train line 4 kilometres across flat land that they already own to South Morang, it's currently under construction at a cost of $650 million. Now, that's half the price of the Alice Springs to Darwin rail line. There must be something wrong somewhere. So, what is the problem? How did we get here? And how can we get out of the problem that we've got ourselves in? Because it seems to me the risk of sounding all medical, you've got to do diagnosis before you do prognosis. So how about a bit of diagnosis? Why is it that even places like Perth, let alone the really kick-butt places like Vancouver, and we haven't even mentioned Europe, but I promise I will, are showing us up? Why can't we do as well as they do? Well, there are various reasons or excuses offered. The first is underfunding. We're not spending enough money. Well, I have a one-word answer to that, and you've heard it already, Mikey. Let's be quite serious about this. If there's one problem that Mikey doesn't have, it's the fact it's insufficient expenditure. $1,350 million for a ticketing system that doesn't work. Supervised, as you may have read in The Age, by a transport ticketing authority that employs 160 staff. Truly extraordinary. They don't run Mikey, you see. A private firm called Camco run Mikey. But in order to select, supervise, monitor and above all spin doctor on behalf of the private firm running the ticketing system, the Transport Ticketing Authority requires 160 staff. No wonder it's costing $1,350 million. Transperth simply appointed 6 of their existing people to do their ticketing project, and after they'd finished it in 18 months, they went back to their old jobs, and now it's run by 3 people. Very confusing. So perhaps it's not insufficient money. In fact, I think we can even go further on the question of insufficient money, because we've talked about Vancouver, we've talked about Perth, but as some of you who may have read The Drum today would be aware, as far as I'm concerned, the pin-up public transport operator in the world is Zurich. They may not be the best in the world, but they're the best in the world that publish stuff in English, or at least the rest of it's in German, and my brother speaks German, so between the two of us we can usually work out what's going on. Now, they run what many people regard as the world's best public transport system, and if they're not, they're certainly in the top 2 or 3. Well, interestingly enough, their system carries about the same number of passengers as Melbourne's, slightly more. Last year they carried the grand total of 567 million passengers. We carried 497 million, so they're a little over 10% higher than us. Their population's smaller, about 30% of Melbourne's, if you take Über Zurich, if you like, Greater Zurich, the canton rather than just the city. But they cover it, if you take the entire state, they use public transport at a much higher rate than us, so they made more trips. Interestingly enough, their fares are slightly lower if you do a Swiss franc to Australian dollar conversion, which is about exactly parity as of today, and so they collected around $600 million in fare revenue last year, which is almost exactly the same as we collected. Of course, in Melbourne it's secret, so you have to kind of dig around to find it out. There you just get it from their annual report. So, similar patronage, similar fare revenue. What about subsidies? Well, their annual subsidy, which you can also get from their annual report, comes to about 360 million Australian dollars, which works out at around 60 cents per passenger. What's Melbourne's annual subsidy? Well, again, it's secret, you see. There's no annual report. There is a state budget paper that says the total expenditure on public transport in Melbourne last year was $2,450 million. Now, that would be something like 7 times the annual subsidy in Zurich. But when this was released to the media by me, the government said, oh, actually, but that isn't the right figure. To which I guess the first question will be, well, why did you publish it if it's not the right figure? What is the right figure? Well, we can't tell you, but anyway, you can kind of work it out from some of the footnotes in the annual report, and it seems to be around 1.5 billion. So in fact, our subsidy is only 4 times as high as Zurich's to carry slightly fewer passengers and to do it less well. That would seem to suggest that the problem isn't insufficient money either. What about Melburnians having a love affair with the car? That must be it. People in Toyota North Altona have an irrational love affair with the car. That's why they don't use public transport. Well, no, there isn't any public transport. They don't have any choice. You wouldn't have to be irrational to drive to a place that you can only get to by car. Your alternative is to be unemployed. So I don't know that we should take that too seriously. Then, of course, there's the argument that our population density is too low. But remember, we started off with Perth. I'm sorry, that one doesn't work. Even Vancouver has about the same population density as Melbourne when you measure it properly. So what are we left with? Well, we've got two things. First of all, we've got capacity. You know the argument, we've got so many passengers now that we couldn't squeeze any more people or trains onto the system, no matter how hard we tried. Now, interestingly enough, this is one of the very few questions that you can answer by going to the Department of Transport's own website. If you go there and put in City Loop, you will see that there's a whole section of historical material that one of their train spotting staff members put up there from the old MERLA, Melbourne Underground Rail Loop Authority, the mob who built the City Loop. One of them is a film released in about 1972 while they were building the loop, outlining what would happen when it was finished. In addition to the film, they even have the transcript as a PDF that you can download. So let me read you the critical line from the transcript of this film from 1972. At the moment, Flinders Street Station handles about 100 trains an hour during peak periods. When the loop comes into operation, the 5-station city terminal will be able to cope efficiently with twice as many trains and twice as many people. Well, that's good. If you get out all your metro timetables and count up all the trains that arrive in the busiest hour, which is 8 to 8:59 a.m, it's currently 97. So not only are we running slightly fewer trains in peak hour than we were before we built the loop, but it was supposed to enable us to run twice as many. So that one doesn't seem to be terribly credible either. What are we left with? I think what we're left with is another capacity problem. Not a capacity problem of the infrastructure. Our rail infrastructure and tram infrastructure are among the most extensive in the world, certainly for a city our size, but the capacity to actually plan and operate, administer and integrate, fund and provide and extend public transport. That kind of capacity. The boring capacity that you don't see pictures of in slideshows. Institutional capacity, administrative capacity, governance capacity, a terrible word that I don't particularly like, but something that, alas, we have to kind of deal with in this common word. So maybe it's bad planning that's the fundamental problem that we have here. Now, if that's the case, that's great news. Why is that? Well, if the problem was population density, we'd have to demolish the city and rebuild it at twice its density. That'll take a long time, cost a lot of money, and Geoffrey Rush might not be very happy about it. Similarly, if the problem is that we need twice as much infrastructure, that will cost a fortune and take another 50 years. And frankly, me and the people out at Monash don't want to have to wait another 50 years for the bus to connect with the train. So if it's bad management and bad government structures, or in fact bad privatised non-governmental structures, then we might actually be able to make a difference in a relatively short period of time. Which brings us to the fact that there's a state election. How do you go about changing these things? The great news is that Perth and Vancouver and Zurich and all these places haven't always been public transport success stories. Even Zurich wasn't always a public transport success story. It was kind of average by European standards, better than us, but nothing to write home about. In each case, there was a dramatic change in the direction of transport policy. And it was messy and it was ugly, but perhaps, as Rob Oakeshott would say, it ended up being beautiful in its ugliness. It was messy and ugly because people lost their jobs. It was messy and ugly because it was based on political conflict. You see, bureaucracies, and even more so privatised corporations that are sucking on the public teat and doing very well out of it and not having to do anything in return, they don't change themselves voluntarily. If you don't believe me, look at what's going on with the banks at the moment. And they don't change themselves just because someone says, oh, I'm really upset and I wish you'd change either. In fact, it's illegal for a private firm to do things that are unprofitable in order to advance the public interest, because their legal obligation is to advance the interest of their shareholders. So the only way any of these cities changed anything was through a kind of political upheaval. It generally meant that a government lost office. In Perth, this was about, in the 1980s, a Liberal government losing office to a pro-public transport Labor government. In Vancouver, it was about a reform group taking control of the city council and on the very first day sacking the chief executive officer and head of head of transport planning of the City Council, and then over the rest of the week sacking most of the rest of the senior officials as well. In Zurich, where they're slightly more civilised about this, it was about a series of referendums. There was a series of referendums put forward by the policy establishment to promote very expensive underground metro projects, sound familiar, that were defeated. And then there was a citizens-initiated referendum for an alternative approach that turned out to work far better, that was actually successful. So in each case, there needs to be, as a German chap who did a lot of investigation into this and whose ideas I'm happy to steal said, you need to have some kind of social crisis in order to open a window to allow policy change to occur. Now, I think that this state election might just be that social crisis for us here in Victoria, or at least in metropolitan Melbourne. And if I don't think it, at least I can hope it. Public transport is the number one issue for the first time in a long time. There's rising discontent. People are mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. I think in addition to that, the fact that there are solutions is starting to get out. Even Ted Baillieu has started saying if they can build new rail lines on time and within budget at an affordable costs in Perth, why can't we do it here? Well, one of the answers, Ted, is that they have a publicly owned public transport authority, just as Vancouver and Zurich and every other city that's kicking goals in these areas do. That's not the only difference. It's also to do with the organisational culture and skill base of the entity that's in charge of things, but it is a critical difference. But the fact that people like Ted Baillieu are now starting to notice that there are all these models of success that we could adopt is fantastic news, because 20 years ago and 30 years ago, we did have argy-bargy about transport policy, but at that stage, you couldn't say for sure what it was that worked. When I was a teenager, everyone was talking about BART. BART isn't a chap, he's a rail system in suburban San Francisco, space-age kind of thing designed by aerospace companies. Everyone thought BART was the answer because it was sexy and space-age and blah, blah, blah. BART doesn't actually carry very many passengers. It carries fewer passengers than ours do. It's the slightly daggy, old-fashioned systems like Zurich's and Perth's and Vancouver's that seem to be getting all the punters on board. So 20 and 30 years ago, we didn't know what we had to do. Now, we do know what we have to do. So the simple question is, how is it possible to break the political stranglehold of the current policy collective, the collective of these hundreds and hundreds of bureaucrats that redundantly staff agencies that don't need to exist, coupled with the private firms that are very happy to collect ever-increasing subsidies for doing next to nothing? Well, that's where politics comes in, and that's where the opportunity of an election comes in. I don't know that any political party has completely committed themselves to dealing with all these problems in precisely the way that me and my Swiss mates would like them done, although I think it's probably fair to say that the Greens have come fairly close to it, but even the Liberals are starting to sniff around the idea that perhaps we can do things better. The government, unfortunately, still reckon it's all part of the plan, but I think the signs are nonetheless positive. When I was in Vancouver many years ago now, talking to the people that run their public transport planning, one of them had actually done an honours thesis at the University of British Columbia comparing transport planning in Vancouver with transport planning in Melbourne. Extraordinary thing, but you see, they thought they could learn something from us because we're very similar countries and cities, and he did, and that was, goodness, we're doing quite well in Vancouver, thanks very much. So he did have one burning question for me, though, and that was, how do they get away with it? Sorry, I said. How do your transport planners, he's talking about the equivalents to himself in our city, how do they get away with it? If we provided a terrible service like that and spent this much money, people would come and burn our headquarters down. I hope he was exaggerating, but I guess I don't know about the Vancouver psyche to that extent. How do they get away with it? Well, I think that's where I'd like to finish. They get away with it because we let them. For many years we let them because we didn't necessarily as a community know that things could be better. We let them because as a community we were prepared to listen to the excuses that are made as to why things can't be better. You know, you can't connect the trains and the trams, says Mr. Pakula, because they run to different frequency. Well, why do they run to different frequencies, Mr. Pakula? I mean, this is not a universal law of physics. Funnily enough, when things are run well, they don't run to different frequencies because they're designed to link up with things. So we make excuses and we allow others to make excuses and we accept those excuses. But maybe it's time we've stopped doing that, and maybe, just maybe, this election will be the time on which we can look back and say that is the time when we did in fact say no more excuses. Thanks very much.